Well, sport is a part of our cultural identity, and new figures show Australians have donated almost $165 million to sport over the past 4 years. There's also been a staggering 41% increase in donations over 12 months. I spoke to Sports Foundation Chief Executive Patrick Walker a short time ago. Patrick, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It's the third consecutive year that the Australian Sports Foundation has received over $43 million. Are you surprised by that figure?
No, not surprised at all, really. Our role, as your viewers may know, is to raise money for Australian sport. And we do that through tax-deductible donations from the community and sports lovers all over Australia. When you think that around $11 billion is donated to charitable and social causes in Australia each year, then $43 million for sport is actually only a drop in the ocean. So we think there's a lot more opportunity and a lot more need for sport in Australia.
There's also been a 41% increase in donations just in the last 12 months alone. Why do you think that is?
Well, we're working with more and more clubs all over Australia. So we work with around 2,000 sports clubs and schools in every state and territory. And we're working with them to help reach out to their communities and their members to raise the funds they need to get more of Australians active through sport. So the increase in the number of donations is really just a factor of us increasing our footprint throughout Australia.
How important is sport in Australia?
Look, I think it's hugely important. Australia's always been known and prided itself really on being a sporting nation. But what I think people sometimes miss is the social value, particularly of community and grassroots sport. Look at some of the major social challenges facing Australia at the moment. Rising levels of inactivity, particularly among our kids. Rising levels of obesity. About 1 in 4 Australians are now overweight or obese. That leads to physical health problems, it leads to mental health problems. And sport has really been shown to play a hugely valuable role both in improving activity and fitness levels, also improving mental health, but more importantly maybe bringing the community together, social cohesion. It's a great way for Australians to mingle and get to know each other and work together. And when you're a multicultural nation like Australia, that's massively important.
And just on that, the figures show that $165 million has been donated over the last 4 years. Why do you think that so many people are really looking at sport and taking up the opportunity?
Well, I think there's a couple of trends. Some of the ones I just mentioned about rising in activity levels needing to be combated, and obviously the need, as I say, to integrate different members of our community. But I think another factor which is really important, particularly over the last few years, is the rising level of female participation, particularly in some of the non-traditional sports. So you look at women's sport, for example. Australia's always had some of the most fantastic female athletes and fantastic elite teams. The Netball Diamonds have been world leaders for 2 decades. The Hockey Roos have also been one of the world's leading teams. But what's happened over the last few years is the rise of female participation in Australian football, in soccer, in cricket, and in rugby union and rugby league. And that's actually placed a huge pressure on a number of things: facilities, change rooms, lack of kit and equipment, lack of female umpires, lack of female coaches. And this is all leading to more and more people in more and more communities wanting to donate to solve those problems.
Let's talk about that, because you are speaking at the Women in Sport conference next week. You've mentioned how sport has developed for women in recent times. How can funding for women's sport improve?
Well, as I just said, there's so many needs that the growth in participation generates, and it's not just the one that gets a lot of airtime, which is lack of female change rooms. It's all the other parts of infrastructure to make sport accessible for females. So what we're doing is working with literally hundreds of clubs, again, all over Australia, to run campaigns to raise funds to actually feed and nurture that female participation, whether it's raising funds to run female umpire coaching programs, or to buy kit or equipment for female teams, or to extend the change rooms, as I've said, so that they're female friendly. We're working with a lot of clubs to raise those funds. And what you find is that the communities understand the importance of growing female participation, having gender equity in sport, and they're very willing to give to support those campaigns.
Overall, Patrick, what are the top fundraising sports?
Top fundraising sport in Australia, probably won't surprise many of your viewers, is Australian football. Australian football raised about $17 million last year at all levels of the game. But we've got a number of other sports that are coming up on the rails, and so golf and rugby union, for example, both raised around $4 million. And we had a huge jump in basketball, which has really fairly recently entered this space. 2 years ago, basketball raised about $200,000 as a sport. Last year, it raised $2 million. So a huge jump in basketball. And that's a fantastic sport for all of the areas I've said, not least as a great way to integrate some of our migrant communities into Australia.
Let's talk about how far the donations go in terms of grants and donations in Australia. What do they go towards?
They go towards a whole range of things that particularly are focused on growing participation. So it often is kit, equipment, uniforms. Probably half the funds go towards facilities. That could be change rooms, as I've said, but it also could be nets for the cricket pitch, or putting floodlights on the oval, or laying down synthetic pitches. So there's a whole range of things, really, that this funding goes to. Literally anything that assists people and communities to participate in sport.
We know that sometimes rural or country areas get overlooked, but sport is, of course, an integral part of rural communities. Does the funding reach those communities?
Yes, it does. Look, we've got a huge focus on rural and regional Australia for exactly the reason you said. It's literally the heartbeat of communities in many of those areas. So we work with other partners as well to reach rural and regional communities. And some of our grant programs that we run are particularly focused on areas outside of Metro Australia. So we're directly trying to address that problem.
Well, certainly sport is part of our cultural identity and everyday way of life. Patrick Walker, appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me.